Chocolate? Chocolate! Chocolate!
Hello everybody, Chocolate Guy here, and welcome back to another countdown. Oh man, here we go. I finally get to talk about Simpsons Season 6. This is a video I've been excited to make for quite a while. The 6th season of The Simpsons is the best of the entire show, and my personal favorite, though the next season is very close. Simply put, any way you look at it, this is the best when it comes to pretty much everything. It's the most consistent season, the most funny, it has the most highs, and the highs it does have are so extremely high. Whereas Season 5 loved its dynamics and being subversive, which led to more character-driven stories, but character-driven stories which were usually used to bend the characters in weird ways, to tell weird jokes, even if we did get a bit more character stuff and a bit more story-driven episodes than the previous seasons. And while it does put the story in a bigger forefront, being more story-driven than ever, with that, Season 6 works like a huge mystery, streamlining a lot of that back, and exploring what makes our characters tick, and how this world works in any given situation to its fullest. If Season 5 really liked to bend its characters in weird ways, then Season 6 likes exploring them and showing them off. Well, this season is very funny, and it uses a lot of these stories to tell jokes. This season really likes to show off its characters in interesting ways and tell very story-driven episodes while being funny. Being funny is never the main goal. And this is what I've wanted out of the show for quite some time. And I'm so glad getting into the season, the show finally gave me exactly what I wanted. And that's what I really love about this season. It loves to examine its characters. It loves to tell more interesting stories that really put these characters in unique situations, but doesn't just go super jokey and over the top with it, which was a problem I did have with a lot of Season 5, despite some obvious exceptions where I think it works perfectly. This is just the natural step up from that season, and it just goes so far to give the most story-driven episodes, which use our characters in great ways, and still has a lot of comedy. And yeah, this season can be super wacky and weird too. There are many episodes that are just really funny, and that's the goal, but the character writing and the stories this time around are just peak Simpsons, for sure. And that's the thing. Because of this season goes so much further with its stories and concepts than ever before. But even with that, in it being so much more story and character driven, to the point where it's the show I really wanted to see, and they're finally going back to some of their roots in Season 2, but doing so much more with it, it doesn't let the comedy suffer. For the first time, I think they balance the comedy and story perfectly throughout the entire season. And that is such an accomplishment, because I think that's what the first 5 seasons were really trying to nail down, especially Season 5. And while I love Seasons 3 and 4 for just how funny they are, and I love Season 5 for how more character-driven it is, while still trying to be funny and super subversive, and I love Season 2 for its very good character episodes, even if it's not very funny, this is just all of it wrapped into one, while making it one of the best shows of all time, because the season is just that good. It's the funniest season, but it's also the most interesting because of all the stuff it does with its story and characters. Every plot is great. It leads to us seeing a really interesting side of everyone in Springfield, making this place and these characters all the more fascinating. I love this season because it's everything I could have ever wanted out of this show and so much more. Each element is fine-tuned perfectly, and the story never suffers for the comedy. The story plays a big focus in the season, and that is how I like it, because they're all so great and introspective, pretty much no matter which episode you pick, besides maybe a few. There are so many episodes to choose from to be considered some of the best, because nearly all of them are great, like I said earlier, and I meant it when I said this season was very consistent in that way and very high quality, so this list on whole was a lot harder to make than the last 3 lists, because with those seasons, even something as weird as Season 5, it feels like there's a general consensus on what a lot of the absolute best episodes are, especially proven by my number 1 choices. But because of how this season works, it's a lot more personalized this time around because of how different everything is. How personal and unique each character study, or each story in each episode, or just the set of jokes this time around really are depending on what episode you're watching. So it's really gonna come down to what sticks with you the most and makes you the most interested. At least it did for me, because this season thrives on interest. Damn, it's just so good, and this list should be very fascinating for that reason, which is why I'm so excited to get into it. Alright, with all that out of the way, let's do that, and jump right into talking about what episodes I think stand on top of the best season of The Simpsons. Here is my list of the top 5 best Simpsons Season 6 episodes. This is the perfect Simpsons episode, and it's only number 5 on this list. Okay, I should rephrase that. This episode has the most perfect concept for a Simpsons episode that is fine-tuned to pretty much the best version of itself it can possibly be, especially in a season like Season 6, and the best set of jokes to boot. And it doesn't seem like an episode about a topic as serious as sexual harassment, or more specifically a false case about sexual harassment, would make that good of a Simpsons episode, but it fits so perfectly, and they get one of the best episodes out of it. I like how fun the beginning of this episode is. It has one of the best disconnected opening acts of the show from what happens later in the episode. How Homer and Marge going to this candy convention is so fun and wacky compared to the rest of the episode, which is really depressing, but gets a lot of jokes out of the depressingness. And it surprisingly leads very well into the actual plot by the Mona Lisa gummy Homer stole in a huge scene from that place being the direct cause of this babysitter thinking Homer is harassing her. And from the beginning, you know this is a big misunderstanding. Homer just wanted the candy on her butt. At the same time, however, you understand why this lady would think Homer did this, and you could totally see Homer headbutting straight into a stupid situation like this. And the rest of this episode is Homer and his family dealing with all the backlash he gets from this in so many different ways, while they're also trying to prove his innocence. And this is why the episode is just so stellar. Everything that comes out of this just works. Every joke they tell around this plot is gut-bustingly hilarious. Even the most strange things, like the Sea Song. It's just great joke after great joke. But at the same time, the episode shows off how this horrible situation plays out from so many different angles, showing every aspect about how bad the situation is, how his life is wrecked because of it, how everyone and everything is screwing him over at every turn, and it makes his interactions with everyone around him just so awkward because of it, including his own family. And what makes it the most interesting is even though you know Homer is innocent and you're rooting for him to prove that innocence, and you know Homer could never do something like this, there's a lot in his character that proves that maybe he could, which makes his family in particular feel very uncomfortable, because even if they believe him, so many people are saying he's lying, and Homer doesn't always do the best things to make himself not seem like a total creep. And that is surprisingly very funny in a sense, but it's also really sad, which just makes this such an interesting but really funny watch. This is such a complete episode for how it handles this complex topic with such tact, and yet has so many subtle and really big, wacky jokes, and blends these two elements perfectly. And how well the episode is paced really helps that. You really get to see how this affects Homer in particular, along with everyone else, and what he has to go through to prove his innocence, and how all this really affects him. It's a very interesting episode that deals with a very serious topic that is sadly still a very big problem today. And surprisingly, it doesn't feel dated, and it does a good job showing the situation that it tries to tackle off. Well, being comedic, obviously, but it all still works because of just how well it's done. Sure, the ending is a bit strange, but this is still a great episode, which puts Homer through such a weird situation they handle with so much tact that it doesn't feel weird, forced, or tasteless in any way, and is really funny to boot. Sure, this episode might not be the funniest, even though I think it has one of the best sets of jokes, and it doesn't do anything absolutely crazy with its concept to make it like a masterpiece or anything that really handles what it tries to tackle well, to show some really deep real-world implications or anything, but what it does with this concept is very good, and does show off some very true-to-life things, while still having the weirdness and wackiness of Simpsons, making it all the more funny, which just once again makes it one of the most impressive episodes of the show, which is why I love it a lot. The reason it isn't any higher is because, well, this is a character-driven episode that looks into Homer's character through a great story that deals with some real-world issues that are still prevalent today and handles it all very well while making it very funny. There are other episodes that hit me harder or impress me much more or somehow go a lot further with their concept. Trust me, for an episode like this to only make it to number 5, it says a lot about where Season 6 takes me. And the next one takes me all the way into the future. Alright, this was definitely an episode everyone was expecting me to put higher. It's one of the best Lise episodes, and I'm the guy who loves a good Lise episode so much in the classic seasons that I put 2 of my favorites at number 1 on previous lists. After all, when she is well written, Lisa is my favorite character of the show. And yeah, I expected this one to be higher too. What can I say other than Season 6 was a crowded neighborhood with strong competition among which episodes were the best. But this is still one of Lisa's best episodes, and here's why. Well, the actual plot of this episode isn't that interesting, with it just being Lisa preparing for her wedding while trying not to have her family ruin her fiancé's experience, who is from the UK and very preppy to say the least. But what they do with this episode, especially the wedding itself, is so good. I like how they show off really well who Lisa is in the future, and why she so fastly falls for this very intelligent guy. Well, through preparing for this wedding, we get a good look at her relationship with each of her family members through this new future perspective, and how her fiancé tries to fit into all of this. What's great about this episode is it shows off this family dynamic we know so well, but with the twist of the passage of time and Lisa's new fiancé being there. They get so much character and story mileage out of this, but also a lot of comedic and setting mileage as well. This is a fun version of the Simpsons world in a futuristic style, and the characters are very interesting for this being set in the future. I haven't seen all of the Simpsons future episodes. I don't know if this is the most interesting version of the future the Simpsons represents. It probably isn't, or these characters for that matter, but it's great for what it is and gives the episode much charm. It makes this world and these characters more interesting, which really helps the plot, but on the comedy note, this episode gets so much comedic mileage out of it. From the funny interaction between our adult characters talking about more adult things, to seeing old versions of normal characters, and all of Homer's weird antics. Never change, homie. But the crux of this episode is Lisa's story of how much she loves this guy and trying to fit him in to this family dynamic that's always been kind of weird for her. That she's always kind of felt out of place in it. It's just so fascinating to explore all this and see it play out, and it slowly builds to the wedding in one of the best scenes in the entire show. Homer's speech to Lisa is truly heartwarming, and is simply put, a great ending to their character dynamic we have slowly seen be explored throughout the show. How even though Lisa has moved very far away from her family in more ways than one, especially Homer, they both have made each other's lives better. And Lisa is the best thing Homer has ever been involved with, and even if they have their differences, on this great day, they can both be happy with each other and how far the two of them have come. It's so interesting, and I love it so much, how throughout the entire series, Lisa tries to fit into this dynamic, but struggles to. And through their conversation, she remembers how much the two of them and their family have been through, and finally seems to fit right in. Everyone gets one great scene with Lisa that kind of completes each of their dynamics in different ways, with her when she finally feels at home. And she realizes her fiancé wants nothing to do with that, which leads to her leaving the wedding, realizing the mistake she has made. Well, the story isn't anything amazing. They go so far with showing off all this interesting stuff about Lisa involving her family in a different time period, using that and her fiancé as an interesting way of showing all this stuff off, and these dynamics we've seen throughout these first 6 seasons kind of be wrapped up in an interesting way. It's really cool. Well, it does show off many cool things and leads to a great end to stuff we've gotten to see developed throughout these seasons. I don't think this episode shows off quite as interesting stuff in as interesting of a way about Lisa's character as some others do, which is why I don't enjoy it as much, even though a lot of the Lisa episodes are very close in quality, and that is very personal preference with how some of the other episodes tackle what they try to tackle and what they actually, go after. But that still makes me put those above this one. Even though I love this one a lot, and as I said, it's very close. This episode is so solid and just shows off so many interesting things and expands upon stuff we have already seen, which is why I could reasonably understand why someone would put this quite a bit above those other episodes I've mentioned earlier. Because man, this is a really powerful one, and I was considering putting it at number 1 for a while, but it being below some of those other Lisa episodes, and the plot, all things considered, not being the most interesting on its own, and maybe not leading to us seeing as much of these dynamics as I think we really could have, even if that's a minor complaint, all things considered, did keep it below some of the other episodes that made it a bit higher, because once again, very strong competition. Because yeah, these top 4 were very close, and one of the best Lisa episodes was surprisingly pushed out for those reasons. So what did top it? Well, something very scary. Oh man, here we go. I finally get to talk about the best Treehouse of Horror episode. I had a hard time placing where I wanted to put this episode on this list. For a little while, it wasn't gonna be on there because I switched this list around quite a bit. It's so technically impressive and is a fun ride from beginning to end and has the best set of stories, being one of the most diverse and creative and entertaining watching experiences of the entire series. But how much does it stack up compared to the very emotional, character-driven story episodes at their best, and some other very impressive episodes in the season? Well, it definitely deserves to make the list, but there are episodes that hit me very hard, and I get more out of watching, even if this one might be very impressive, and I enjoy watching it quite a lot. In the end, I just think this one is strong enough to beat out a few very strong entries and make it to number 3, but there are 2 episodes that just affect me so much watching them, and I just take so much away from them that they could only be the number 2 and 1 spots. But before we get to what those are, let me talk about why this episode is so great and is just so damn impressive that I put it above an episode like Lisa's Wedding, which is just so handcrafted to be one of my personal favorites in particular. Unlike the last 2 episodes, I have no even minor problems with this one. From start to finish, it's just great, spooky Halloween bliss, which gives you 3 very different stories with so much comedy at the same time, while some of them are legitimately creepy, and one of them is kind of horrifying. It is truly the ultimate Halloween special. In order to really dive into why, I have to talk about each story like I did last time. The Shinning is, simply put, the best Treehouse of Horror segment of all time. It's a great parody that the characters fit in perfectly, like it's unreal how well they fit into it. They get so many jokes out of this concept, and it's also genuinely creepy for how ridiculous Homer dives into his insanity. And the atmosphere and art direction is some of the best of the entire series. It's truly astounding just how fantastic it is, which is a great bonus and adds to the creepiness of it all and just how ridiculous it all is, which makes the jokes even funnier. Top that all off with these great little character interactions, using the parody to its fullest advantage, and everything with Homer being amazing and some of the best material of the entire show, and you have a top tier segment indeed. Time Punishment is one of the funniest Treehouse of Horror segments of all time. It's just Homer traveling through time with so many weird and wacky outcomes, and how he keeps making mistakes, which leads to them. I love how it all plays out, and just how much they get out of all these different things happening, and all the weird scenarios they do. It's not the best one here, because they don't do a crazy ton with it, or as much as maybe they could have. Maybe they could have done a bit more with this concept, but that's a very minor nitpick, and it's still just such a fun one, and one of the most creative ever, sandwiched between the very artistic and spooky first segment, and the legitimately scary third one, so it's a very nice one to put right in the middle, because of just how creative, fun, and funny it is. Nightmare Cafeteria is legitimately horrifying. The premise is really creepy, the way they execute it is so funny but genuinely disturbing and off-putting. They do a really good job showing how the whole situation escalates, and the helplessness a child feels during school that is amped up to 1,000 here. And just how creepy every little bit of this plot is, leading to so many good jokes out of it. and legitimately tense moments with a fun climax to boot. It's another one of the best Treehouse of Horror segments, and once again, the story and how they execute it is just so creepy, but really funny at the same time. They balance both very well, leading to a great segment and a great end to the 3 stories. All this is ended with a fun song that encapsulates everything about this episode and everything about Halloween for that matter, making this the perfect Halloween special. So yeah, this episode is truly a work of art. I love everything about it. Each story plays off each other perfectly. They're ordered really well. Each story just fits so well together, and it all leads to being the perfect package, and just having the best stories in general. It's truly one of the show's best episodes, and easily the best Treehouse of Horror episode, but as I said, being impressive isn't what's always gonna get you to number 1. In a season as story and character driven as this one, there were 2 episodes that just do so much more. Oh man, these next 2 are in a whole nother league. This episode is probably the best in the season, and just one of the best of the entire series. I said in my season 2 video, The Way We Was is my favorite flashback episode, or at least close to that spot, but after rewatching this episode, oh man, I can't believe I said such blasphemy. Well, that episode is great. Maggie Makes 3 is easily the best flashback episode of the series, and one of the best episodes. Up there with most of the episodes that made number 1 on other lists. But it's not number 1 on this one for reasons I'll get into in a little bit. But let's focus on why this episode is great before we get into all that. Simply put, unlike the last 3 seasons, the best episodes of season 6 aren't at the top of the list because of comedy. Otherwise, Homer Badman and many of the great episodes that made the honorable mentions would have been higher up, more around number 1. No, story was what really won out this time, and how it looks at its characters, and no other episode shows this aspect off quite better than Maggie Makes 3. I just adore the story here, and this characterization of Homer. The story of leaving your crappy job to take part in your dream job, but having to quit because you accidentally got your wife pregnant and can't afford this new baby unless you go back to your crappy one that makes you miserable, is a really great but tragic story that I think fits Homer so well and shows off many different sides of his character, how much he hates his job and how content he is with this new one, how happy it makes him, how it fulfills him, and how it makes his life complete in his eyes. He has 2 kids, a beautiful wife, and a job he absolutely adores. Because he's so financially stable, he can live the best life he could possibly ever want to live under the circumstances he's in. It's so great to see him this happy and in such a good state, because they do a good job showing how much he hates his job at the power plant through how he quits and how much he enjoys this one and how it just makes his life pretty much perfect. And that is something I think could resonate with many. Getting a job you really like, or having a piece of your life kind of click everything else into place to the point where you're very happy and content with life. And this really makes you like Homer as you get to see every facet of his job and just how happy it all makes him. This is what he wants to do, but he can't, because when he has to give it all up, it's so heartbreaking. You see how deeply this saddens him, and how he doesn't know what to do, how wanting to have a good time celebrating what he considers to be the best life he could possibly live leads to his wife getting pregnant and him having to give it all up so he can have a third kid. You get to see how much he struggles with this, and how after spending so much time at this job and loving it dearly, he quits, and humiliatingly goes back to his old one. This episode is such a perfect character study of Homer. It shows off so much about his character through him getting a new job and struggling with all these events playing out, and Homer telling the story himself gives us better insight into all of this and makes the episode way more funny. Homer messes around with the story quite a bit, which leads to a lot of good jokes. This episode does so much with the flashback because of this, due to how Homer tells the story. But while the story is really good and tragic and shows off so many interesting things about Homer, his life, and what's really important to him, really the true reason why it's this high is because of Do It For Her. I said in the last season that Homer in Rosebud is one of the most endearing he's ever been, and it builds up his character so much. But that is nothing compared to this episode. This episode makes you care about him so much, really get into his story he's telling here, and he's being a part of, and showing how much he loves this job, and how his life is great, but he has to give that all up for a kid. You really get into what's going on, and you really like Homer, and you understand why this is so frustrating for him, and how he's not looking forward to this child at all, because she's the thing that's throwing his life back into something he's not enjoying, and unstable to say the least, because of how much he hates his job. And after everything Homer has to go through, giving up that dream job to work a job he despises for a child he didn't even want, when he sees his daughter be born, the twist of it all is that she inspires him to do this job so he can afford to raise her. And that image is one of the most powerful and inspiring of the show. It shows just how much his daughter means to him, and is truly powerful, wrapping up one of the most funny, introspective, and powerful episodes of the series. This episode is everything I love and want out of The Simpsons, and its fullest potential it can possibly reach. It really shows off how he tries to deal with this hardship of going back to the job he hates, and how he tries to justify why it's the right thing to do, and why this is something he needs to do due to his child being born, and how interesting it is to just get into his head and see how hard this decision is to make, and see what he tries to do to justify it. And in the end, he doesn't need to make any justifications, because his daughter is the only thing he needs to prove that this is worth it, so he can raise her and make sure she grows up in a good environment where he's actually making money. This episode goes above and beyond everything it tries to accomplish, and was so close to topping the list because of just how much of an interesting character study it is of Homer, and how great this plot is, and honestly, just how much of a punch to the gut it is. The reason why a lot of people are the biggest fans of Season 5, and why I'm not the biggest fan of it, at least compared to Season 6 and 7, is because while it is more character and story driven than ever before, it uses all of that to bend its characters in weird ways, and tell weird plots that, yeah, do look into our characters a bit more, but are still used to tell a lot of jokes, and that being kind of the main focus. With Season 6, however, it really does return to some of the roots of stuff like Season 2, where you really dived into characters and really got those gut-punching moments and those emotional highs from just how far they go showing off what they try to show off, and how emotional and schmaltzy it can be, but in the best possible way for just how much you get into these stories because of just how good and developed and interesting they all are. And this episode is one of the best examples and was so close to topping the list for just how great it all is, how great this story is, how much you can understand Homer's struggle to justify why he needs to do something like this, but realizing it in the end, it's just his daughter, and his daughter is what's really important to him. And it should all be enough for it to be number one. It was so close. But there was one other episode that barely beat it out. And oh man, does it bug me, because this is truly one of the best Simpsons episodes. But there's one episode this season that is better. Alright, well, the last few episodes we've seen have proven how great this season is, and are some of the best of the series, including my number one, which managed to top them all, which I'll get into in a little bit. This season was so solid, and had so many other highs, many of which were so close to making the list, and in previous seasons would have. That just shows how amazing this season was, and every one of them deserves to be recognized for making Season 6 what it is. There are 15 honorable mentions, so let's get into it. A great opening to the season, and while it might not be one of the absolute best, it's still a really fun episode. It sets the more mystery / character and story focused tone well, and juggles the pool plot and Bart thinking Flanders killed Maude while he is injured plot well. It has a lot of fun with both of these, and uses how totally different the two of them are to make the whole experience more complete and fulfilling. We've come a long way since Homer's Odyssey, is all I'm saying. This makes the episode very interesting, suspenseful, and incredibly funny with many good jokes. It's not the most complete episode. The sections are so tonally different that it doesn't lead to the most complete results. And even if I love this episode and it handles both stories well, each section of the episode can feel a bit underdeveloped at points, at least for my liking. But it's still a great episode and a nice start to the season. The actual present-day, Lisa-centric episode of the season, and it's great. It's not as emotion-driven as something like Moaning Lisa, or as character relationship-focused as Lisa's Substitute, or a weird futuristic mix of both, like Lisa's Wedding. It's a much more witty and tightly paced episode that looks at how Lisa tries to present herself, and the mold she tries to fit, and how that's challenged due to this rival. It's a good look into her character, and I like how the episode slowly shows this rival off, leading to a fun conflict with many great jokes. It's a very clever episode on many fronts, and once again, very witty, especially with its jokes. It's not the most in-depth or interesting Lisa episode. I get a lot less out of this one than some others, but it's so different compared to them, which makes it a great watch either way, and hey, I'm still always a fan of a great Lisa episode that makes her very interesting and shows off her character through any way possible, and this does just that. But damn, that means no traditional Lisa episode will be making the list, because this only ended up in an honorable mention spot. Oh well, maybe next season, though I doubt it. A very fun episode about the whole family going to this weird amusement park, which leads to many great jokes and an interesting outcome. While not the most ambitious of the season, and the actual individual plot points might be kind of dumb, it really is just a great setup to tell as many theme park related jokes as possible, and they do take their jokes to some very interesting places, leading to some of the best and most classic ones of the season. Which leads to this overall being a very great and funny episode with too many standout moments to count. One of the best Sideshow Bob episodes that surprisingly involves politics. There's many funny political jokes here, along with the fun aspect of Sideshow Bob's presence in general with his weird plan. It's fun seeing him run against Mayor Quimby, and his clash with Bart and Lisa, leading to many great things, and a fun final confrontation. This one doesn't do as much for me personally, even if I find the political stuff very funny, and they get many smart jokes out of it, and I just like seeing this story develop and how many different places they take it. It's just not the best Sideshow Bob episode compared to some others, and I don't think it's as funny or as interesting as other episodes in the season, which is why it didn't make the list, but damn, is it still a very strong episode for the positive points I pointed out, and a very strong honorable mention at that. Bart's girlfriend has a good story that puts Bart through an interesting dilemma, and I like seeing all the interesting things he has to go through here. This is a fun Bart-centric episode, and his girlfriend compliments him while putting him through a very different situation, which leads to some interesting events and character bits. I like how this episode breaks down Bart's character and how bad he actually is, and what his limits are, so when he is challenged by this girl in more ways than one, it's very interesting. It is a pretty simple episode, all things considered, maybe a little too simple for my liking. There are certain things involving the story that are kind of underdeveloped near the end, which could have made the conflict more interesting if they were developed more. They don't go far enough with certain things, but this episode is still great overall. A fun rivalry story between Lisa and Bart, which doesn't start out that way, and is just a fun plot about ice hockey with the two of them involved, and slowly builds up into a big rival story that does show off both their characters well, and their strengths in life through them playing hockey, and their rivalry, which is fueled by their parents. Okay, mostly Homer. It's pretty interesting and very funny. There are many great jokes, and all of this leads to a fun conflict and sweet ending. What brings the episode down for me, once again, is that it doesn't go far enough with its story. It doesn't show off Bart and Lisa's relationship in that interesting of a way, and is more of just a fun conflict with many great jokes, with the interesting character dynamic being a little bit of a plus and not the main selling point. And also, the thing that holds this one back for me is Homer can get really irritating. Way more than I feel like his character should be in this episode, even if it does move the plot along in a good way a lot of the time. It's still a bit much and does get on my nerves when watching it, when it really shouldn't. But these are very minor problems overall for a very strong episode. This used to be one of my absolute favorites of the season, and while it isn't anymore, it's still an interesting episode about Homer and Abe's relationship through this weird plot, with a fun subplot that doesn't really go anywhere, but as I said, is still fun. And while I find this episode very interesting and pretty funny, it's just paced in such a strange way overall, which really holds it back for me. A very interesting episode that dives into Marge's fear of flying, and while it's not the most detailed episode in the world, it's still very interesting and goes very far with showing off Marge's fear and how it affects her and the root cause of it, even if it is kind of a joke in the end. But it does still dive into all of this stuff very well, making it a very great episode and a good showcase of what Season 6 does really well. On top of that, the opening act is great, and for such a slow, introspective episode, it has some of the best jokes of the series. This used to be an episode I wasn't that fond of because it was just very slow in my eyes, and I didn't find the plot of this episode to be too interesting, but watching it again, I just find the opening act so funny, and the plot to be a lot more interesting than I gave it credit for, just for how far it actually goes with it, even if it might not go far enough for my liking, and some of the actual key plot points which could have been interesting just end up being jokes in the end, it still is a very interesting episode. While some consider this to be one of the best of the series, I just think it's great. It has a fun plot with many great jokes and twists and turns, even if I don't think it's as interesting or funny as other episodes. Surprisingly, that's all I really have to say. This one I actually added last second because while I'm not the biggest fan of this episode, over thinking about it more, I realized I love how grand this one feels, and how this concept of this comet coming to Springfield and killing everyone leads to just so many great jokes and moments. The episode has such high stakes, yet doesn't take itself too seriously, so it isn't overdramatic. I can definitely see why an episode like this would be somebody's favorite, or at least in the ballpark as one of their favorites, even if it's not for me, because I do think this episode is very strangely paced at points, and that makes some of the episode not the most interesting to watch, and I don't find all the jokes amazingly funny, but it's still just so grand and still just has so many jokes that really work. So I think it deserves to be an honorable mention. This episode just has such a fun story, which leads to many great scenes and jokes, but what makes this truly fantastic and one of the season's best is the great climax because of how smart the callback is. While this episode isn't the most engaging due to some slower moments, when it picks up, damn does it pick up, which leads to such a fun one. An interesting story involving Homer's relationship with Patty and Selma, which shows off his character really well and leads to many interesting scenes between them. While it's not the best paced episode, and the plot itself isn't the most interesting, it's still cool to see these characters bounce off of each other, which makes this plot what it is, and really gives it a lot of interesting elements, and that overall makes it a great episode. The PTA Disbands is a fun episode about the teachers striking and all the different things it leads to, along with how it affects the students and people involved. It's a great episode with many cool outcomes of this plot and jokes. So while I really have no issues with this, and this episode is kind of the best version of itself it can possibly be, and is just such a solid episode from pretty much every angle, there wasn't really anything that pushed it over the edge for me to make the list proper. Lemon of Troy is one of the smartest, most well-paced episode of the series. It was so close to making the list because the plot is just so good and leads to so many great scenes and interesting character pairings and funny parallels between Shelbyville and Springfield and just so many other great jokes to count. But the episode actually does a good job of making you care about the story, which leads to some very intense moments, a fun climax, and my favorite callback in the entire show, the Roman numerals. Because once again, the pacing is excellent, and this was so close to making the list due to it being one of the episodes I enjoy watching the absolute most, and it just being so goddamn impressive in pretty much every way. It's just such a well put together episode that is such a fun ride from start to finish, but has so much more extra little things to make it so much better. But I did just enjoy Homer's Bad Men more, and there are other episodes on the list that either impress me more or I get more out of watching, which sucks because this episode is truly fantastic, even compared to many others in Simpsons Season 6. But strong competition did inevitably keep it out of the top 5, so you can consider this the very strong honorary number 6. This is the perfect finale of the season. It shows off Mr. Burns' character well, slowly builds up to the title of the episode, perfectly gives everyone a reason due to how well this episode is paced and how well the plot is executed to why they would shoot Mr. Burns, which also leads to many great jokes, has so much going on, but balances it all perfectly from Mr. Burns' evilness, which really pulls it all together with great atmosphere and even great staging and direction, which is some of the best of the entire series. And when the shot does happen, it leaves you with a perfect cliffhanger, setting you up for Season 7. And that's what just kept it off the list for me, is that it is a lot of setup, which is all great. It's some of the best setup you will ever see, but it's not what I'd want to come back to the most, especially in a season as strong and as ambitious as Season 6, with so many impressive contenders and episodes that I just get more out of watching. Though it does lead into Season 7 well, but before we dive into that, let's finish this list by finally talking about my favorite episode of Simpsons Season 6. And after all these amazing episodes I've listed off, and the ones that did make the list proper, what topped all of them? Hell yeah! I surprised you, didn't I? The Queen, after 3 seasons of absence, is back at the #1 spot on these lists. And after 3 seasons of the most obvious choices for my #1 pick, I finally have one, which is a genuine surprise. Even for me, the one making the list. I did not expect this to make #1, but the more I thought about it, the more it felt right. This is probably the hottest take I will ever have on this channel. And this is coming from the same guy who is making a individual episode review that will be coming out soon on another hot take I made earlier in the Simpsons list series. But more on this one, I might not be able to back this take up, all things considered, because of all the episodes on this list, especially Maggie Makes 3, are great episodes, and a lot of people consider them to be better, but I don't care. This is my favorite episode of Season 6, and the most underrated episode of the season. And here's why. This episode is a great, but very different successor to Moaning Lisa, and it uses Bleeding Gums Murphy to tackle something very different for a Lisa episode around this time. In this episode, Lisa is actually in a good state of mind at first. She's not dealing with how to regulate her emotions or some other problem involving her life. She is pretty happy here, up until the big event happens in this episode. Because what this episode is actually about is the death of Bleeding Gums Murphy, this minor character, but person who meant so much to Lisa, even if he wasn't that big of a part of her life. He still meant so much to her because of how much the interactions they had influenced her, made her a much better and happier person, and just the impact those interactions left on her. So the rest of the episode focuses on her trying to deal with this and figure out a way to spread this pretty irrelevant, for lack of a better term, guy's legacy to the world through his music that was never very successful or well known while he was alive. And that's the first thing I'll bring up, is that I love this story. I think the story of Lisa trying to get more people to know about this man who meant so much to her is very interesting and is a story with a lot of heart to it. Every time I watch this episode, I end up just feeling so much for what Lisa's going through. The episode does such a good job in the first half, building up how important this guy is to her through a really great song just for him to die, and for her to be left with pretty much nothing, and realizing that even though he left a big impact on her life, he really didn't leave that big of an impact on anyone else's. And she doesn't know how to feel about this. And in the episode, you get to kind of see her struggle with that, while also trying to make sure no one forgets this man who was just so important to her. It's an interesting story, and while it's not one of the most complex of the series, it's pretty straightforward, all things considered. The emotions are real, and the feelings this episode shows off are super powerful. This is a story that fits Lisa well. She is emotionally mature enough and at the right age where this death would hit her pretty hard, but would also have a hard time dealing with the death of this person in her life. We really get to see how this affects her, and this is where the biggest strength of the episode comes from. How this all just affects her so deeply, but this man meant pretty much nothing to anyone else. How can she feel so sad and struggles to understand why others just don't seem to care, is what she struggles with throughout the entire episode. She shows up to this man's funeral and is the only one. This whole conflict is so interesting, and something that I think anyone can take something out of. The idea of someone important to you dying, and you not knowing how to react, and feeling like you owe it to them to keep their legacy alive, or at least spread their importance to other people, so other people know who they were as well, is something that hits me very hard in particular, because of experiences in my life. So seeing Lisa not understand why she feels this way, but understanding she owes it to Bleeding Gums Murphy for how he has helped her in the past, to make him known and to get others to understand why he was so important to her as an influence, even if just for his music, it's really powerful, and I'm super invested to see Lisa succeed here. Once again, it's not the most complex story, but this episode does deal with some very difficult topics, more so than many others this season, which I don't think it gets credit for. This episode goes from an interesting look into how Lisa deals with the death of this man to an inspiring story of her trying to spread his legacy to more people, and it's great. You generally don't know if her plan is going to work, but god damn it, you want to see her try. And this very serious and interesting main plot is balanced perfectly by this very funny Bart story. How we spend so much time setting up the importance of this man to Lisa, and how she wants to spread his legacy to other people, while at the same time, you have a really funny story about Bart getting hurt from Krusty's cereal and suing the pants off of him. The two plots are so drastically different, and have such different tones at that, but are put together quite well, and complement each other greatly. Also, it's a contrast in more ways than one, with Lisa's story being about her trying to spread the legacy of someone she looks up to through his music who has passed away recently, while Bart's story is about him ruining the reputation of someone he looks up to who is still alive, and whose carelessness did actually end up putting Bart in danger. One is very introspective and deeply thought out, the other is very straightforward, to the point, and something Bart does just to get back at Krusty. This makes for a very interesting and diverse watch. But to talk more about the comedy, well, this isn't one of the funniest episodes of the season, it's pretty great. This just has so many jokes throughout, which makes such a sad and introspective episode a really fun watch. It's just so different comedically from the rest of the season. The people who worked on The Critic worked on this episode, plus A Star Is Burns in this season, which gives both of those episodes very different feels as far as comedy goes. And while A Star Is Burns is alright, this episode is so much better. It uses a different style of comedy than the show usually uses, and smartly fits it right into the show, perfectly taking the best elements of both shows' humor. There's just so many good gags here, and this makes it very unique amongst other Simpsons episodes for just how meta it is. And while I'm not usually the biggest fan of the Critic style of humor, or the Critic as a show, all things considered, how they balance it here makes it really work for me. On top of all of this, the atmosphere is fantastic. It really sets the mood of any given scene and helps bring out the emotion. It's also what helps balance the sadness and seriousness of one plot with all the gags and silliness of another. It brings out the full potential of both. Cap all this off with a pretty sweet but meta ending where the money Bart gets from this case he gives to Lisa to buy this man's album so she can play it for all of Springfield. And in one last moment, she plays her saxophone with the legacy of Bleeding Gums Murphy she helped keep alive. It's really weird, like many things in this episode, and kind of meta for its weird film parody aspect, like some other things in this episode as well. It's a very film-like episode in that way, but it's still a lot of fun, and that image is a very striking and powerful one. The way they balance the more meta and kind of universal film-centric humor and story really works here to make this image at the end something special and a great ending to the episode. You don't really know if what Lisa did really will mean much in the long run, but you at least feel that she thinks what she did will leave a lasting impact. And that's what I love especially about this episode, is just that it shows off this interesting story of Lisa trying to spread this man's music around so more people know about him, and even if that's not what ends up happening in the end, she is still satisfied with the results and can move on, which is really cool, and I think the ending really resembles that. And that's really what ends up putting it on top of the list for me. Maggie Makes 3 might be the most hard-hitting episode, the one with the best story, and probably the best jokes as well, but this episode is just such a trip every time I watch it. I find it much more interesting of a watch, honestly, and there really isn't any other episode of The Simpsons like it, which is not something I can say for any other episode on this list. Yes, this season is very personalized. Yes, all the episodes in my top 5 are incredibly creative and different from anything else in the show, but they all do still share similarities to other episodes, even if they're the best versions of some of the plots or subject matters they try to tackle. This episode is just so wildly different from anything else, and simply put, I just get more out of watching this episode. The story personally hits me harder, even if it's not as emotional, and it just tells this very interesting and universal story in such a cool way with so much extra stuff due to how different the comedy is here and how meta and weird it is, but it really makes this such a joy of an episode to watch for something that's about a very tragic topic. It's the best of all worlds. It's the one I enjoy watching the most, and hey, I know that might not be enough for some people to justify putting it at number 1, and you might still hardcore disagree with me, and hey, that's fair. But I do ask that you go back and re-examine this one, because you might not get anything out of it, and you might find it a weird mismatch of things that don't really fit, or like me, you'll find a strange episode that has a lot of very different elements, but puts them all together perfectly, making for one of the most interesting viewing experiences you've ever had, because that's what it was for me. It's such a complete episode. It's so weird and different and tackles very interesting things, and for all of that and so much more, that is why in such a personalized and interesting and introspective and mystery-driven season, this is my #1 episode above all the rest, and my favorite of Season 6. And with that, my list is done. I want to thank you all for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this very long video. It was definitely an interesting one, and I think it was a lot of fun to make. Now I would like to apologize for the lack of videos overall this summer. I know I have promised many things, like 2 videos a month this year, and more videos coming out in the summer, and many other promises I just couldn't keep, and for that, I'm sorry if I disappointed anyone, and once again, I apologize. There's so much I want to do on this channel, and things just don't always work out. But on my lack of videos recently, well, I thought I would have more time in the summer, a lot of circumstances came up, and there just hasn't been a lot of time for me to make videos, and when there was time, I just wasn't very interested. I have a lot going on in my personal life, and a lot on my mind. So production of videos has been slow, and my last 2 videos in particular have shown this. And I wish that I was gonna have more time to more frequently upload, and I was more interested in doing so, but honestly I'm not. My schedule is only gonna get busier getting out of the summer, and I'm just not in the place right now where I wanna constantly be focusing on videos. I love this channel. I love making content about TV shows and seeing people's reactions to it and just talking about this stuff in general, but I'm just not in a place right now where I can do that very often, especially for the kind of very big, long list videos I want to make. So because of that, I am announcing that I'm going on hiatus. This is not the end of the channel. I have so much more I want to do here, and I will definitely be back, whether this be a short hiatus, like a month or so, like some of the unofficial ones I've been on, or it be like a half a year from now. I will definitely be back with more content. I love this channel. I want to keep making more videos, but right now, I just can't. And I'm sorry if this is sad news for anyone, but I hope you've enjoyed my content up until this point, or if you're new, you decide to check out more, because I will be back with more great things in the future. Thank you for understanding. When I do get back from that hiatus, though, the next video will be that individual episode review of Homer's Night Out. That is still a video I really want to make, even though I've been having a harder time working on it than I thought I would. I still really like the idea, and I think it'll be very interesting. So that will be what comes out next, and when I decide to start making videos again, that's what I'll prioritize to be the first thing that comes out. And after that, the next list video will be the worst episodes of Hey Arnold Seasons 1 through 3, which is something I said would come out at the end of the summer, but with my schedule and how the other videos ended up coming out a lot slower than I thought they would, that just didn't really end up happening. But those 2 videos will come out whenever I start uploading videos again. I also have many other video ideas I hope to share and hope get made into actual videos one day, but we'll see if any of them actually happen, because I'm not going to promise anything based off of promises I haven't been able to keep in the past for multiple reasons. With all that said, getting into the usual outro of these videos, please leave a like if you enjoyed the video, and subscribe for more content whenever that comes out. Leave a comment below about what you thought of the list, and what your own list would have been. Also, links are in the description to other videos if you haven't checked them out already, and all the music I used in this video. And with all that said, until whenever the next video comes out, this is Chocolate Guy, signing off. Take care, everybody.